They said it never happened. Yet across frozen manuscripts, burned chronicles, and whispered court records, one pattern keeps repeating. When a crown fell, it was rarely the blade you saw that ended it, but the one you never did. And in the Middle Ages, from the years 500 to 1500, there were forces moving in silence, operating beneath banners and thrones, carrying out a kind of war that never appeared on official maps. A war without borders, without declared enemies, and without mercy recorded in the pages of kings. Some called them assassins, others called them shadows. But the truth is far more unsettling than any name history has preserved. Because what if these groups were not isolated legends at all, but parts of a hidden network that shaped entire kingdoms from behind the veil of secrecy? And what if the greatest empires of the medieval world were not destroyed only by armies on open fields, but by a coordinated struggle fought in silence, where information was deadlier than steel? In the courts of Europe, in the deserts of the Levant, and along the fractured edges of collapsing empires, strange patterns began to emerge. Leaders disappearing without clear explanation, rival factions collapsing overnight, and entire political structures shifting as if guided by an unseen hand. Official records would later attribute these moments to coincidence, betrayal, or fate, but some scribes left behind warnings, fragments suggesting something more organized, more deliberate, and far more dangerous operating beneath the surface. To understand this hidden war, we must first step away from the version of history that was carefully preserved and instead look at the gaps, the missing pages, and the contradictions that were never meant to be connected. Because in those gaps lies the possibility that medieval history was not only written by victors, but edited by them as well. And what remains is only the surface of something far deeper. If you think history is already fully known, you might want to reconsider that certainty, because what follows suggests that some wars were never meant to be remembered at all. And if you want to uncover what lies beneath those missing records, make sure to stay with this story, because we are only just beginning to see the outline of something that was never supposed to be seen. In the decades following the early formation of medieval power structures, a second layer of political reality began to emerge, one that existed parallel to the visible world of kings, knights, and crusaders. On the surface, Europe and the surrounding regions appeared to be defined by open conflict, territorial expansion, and religious campaigns. Yet beneath these recorded events, another system of influence was developing, one that did not rely on banners or armies marching in formation. Instead, it operated through secrecy, mobility, and precision, using individuals trained not for conquest in the traditional sense, but for disruption at the most critical points of power. These individuals were not officially recognized as soldiers in any kingdom's ledger, yet their actions consistently aligned with moments of sudden political instability. In certain regions of the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean, particularly during the period of the Crusader states and their surrounding rival dynasties, isolated references begin to appear in fragmented accounts describing highly disciplined groups operating outside conventional military command. They were not part of standing armies, nor were they mercenaries in the usual sense, but something more specialized and far more difficult to categorize. Some records refer to them as hidden agents of influence, others as oath-bound operatives tied to rigid internal codes, and a few describe them only in fear-laden metaphors that suggest their presence was understood more as a force than an organization. What makes these references particularly significant is not their consistency, but their repetition across unrelated regions, suggesting that multiple cultures were encountering the same type of phenomenon without fully understanding its structure. In the courts of Europe, when a ruler unexpectedly shifted alliances or a noble line collapsed without a clear military defeat, chroniclers often struggled to provide explanations that matched the speed and precision of these changes. Similarly, in the Levant, during periods of intense political fragmentation, there are accounts of leaders withdrawing from public life under circumstances that remain unclear, followed by rapid restructuring of local authority. While official explanations frequently attributed these events to illness, betrayal within families, or simple misfortune, the timing and coordination of these occurrences suggest a level of synchronization that exceeded coincidence. Some scholars of the period, particularly those who documented events from outside official court sponsorship, hinted at the existence of intermediary groups capable of influencing outcomes without engaging in open warfare. These groups, according to scattered interpretations, did not seek to hold territory directly, but instead aimed to control the conditions under which power itself could exist. This represents a fundamental shift in the concept of conflict during the medieval era, because it implies that warfare was no longer limited to visible confrontation, but had extended into the realm of perception, secrecy, and controlled uncertainty. If such a system truly existed, it would mean that many of the turning points recorded in medieval history were not spontaneous at all, but the result of carefully executed operations designed to remain invisible to the very chroniclers recording them. And it is within this possibility that the first structural outline of the hidden conflict begins to take shape, revealing not isolated acts, but a coordinated pattern that challenges everything preserved in the official narrative of the Middle Ages. As the hidden patterns of influence continued to emerge across fragmented chronicles of medieval Europe and the Near East, the narrative begins to shift from scattered anomalies into something far more structured and deliberate. What earlier appeared as isolated political disruptions or unexplained transitions of power now begins to resemble a consistent operational rhythm repeated across different regions and centuries. In multiple court records preserved from the 11th and 12th centuries, there are subtle but persistent indications that certain events did not unfold organically, but instead followed a sequence that suggests coordination beyond the awareness of public authority. These accounts rarely agree on terminology, yet they converge on a shared impression that some form of organized interference was shaping outcomes from behind the visible structures of governance. Within this emerging framework, the groups previously described as hidden agents or oath-bound operatives begin to take on a more defined role. They are increasingly portrayed not as independent actors, but as components within a larger system of strategic balance, deployed selectively to influence key moments in political and military history. Importantly, these influences were not recorded as direct confrontations or conventional battles, but as sudden shifts in leadership, unexplained policy reversals, and the rapid dissolution of alliances that had appeared stable only weeks or months earlier. The lack of direct attribution in official sources is itself part of what makes the pattern so compelling, because it suggests that the effectiveness of these operations depended entirely on remaining outside the formal record of events. In several regions affected by prolonged instability, particularly along contested trade routes and border territories, there are descriptions of intermediary figures who seem to operate with unusual freedom of movement between rival factions. These figures were not documented as diplomats or envoys in any official capacity, yet their presence is repeatedly associated with moments of political realignment. Some chroniclers describe them in indirect language, noting only that decisions were made without counsel, or that alliances dissolved without open cause, phrases that, while vague on their own, become more significant when viewed collectively across multiple independent sources. As these patterns accumulate, a broader structure begins to emerge, suggesting that the medieval world may have contained a parallel system of conflict management, operating beneath the surface of recorded history. This system did not rely on large-scale armies or territorial conquest, but instead focused on precision interventions designed to alter the direction of power before it could fully manifest in open warfare. If this interpretation holds any validity, then the historical record as it exists today may represent only the visible outcomes of deeper processes that were intentionally concealed. The implications of such a structure challenge the conventional understanding of medieval geopolitics because they suggest that what appears to be chaos in the historical narrative may in fact be the result of highly controlled and strategically guided actions, operating beyond the awareness of those who documented them. As the pattern of hidden influence continued to evolve across medieval territories, the structure behind these unexplained political shifts appears to become more defined, as if an invisible framework was gradually tightening its reach over multiple regions at once. By the 13th century, certain chroniclers began to document events with a noticeable sense of uncertainty, as if they were witnessing outcomes whose causes had already been decided elsewhere. In these accounts, the visible actions of rulers and armies are often described in detail, yet the underlying reasons for sudden strategic changes remain absent or deliberately obscured. This growing disconnect between recorded actions and recorded explanations suggests that something operating outside formal governance may have been shaping decisions before they reached the public stage of history. Within this environment, the role of the previously described hidden operatives appears to expand beyond isolated influence and into a more coordinated form of strategic pressure applied across multiple regions simultaneously. Rather than acting as independent actors tied to specific courts or factions, they are increasingly portrayed in fragmented sources as part of a distributed network capable of responding to political instability in real time. This network, while never formally acknowledged in any surviving official document, is implied through patterns of correlation that appear too consistent to be dismissed as coincidence. For example, in several regions experiencing succession disputes, there are accounts of sudden shifts in loyalty among key advisors and regional leaders occurring within extremely short timeframes, often before public announcements of political change were made. These sequences suggest the possibility that decisions were being influenced or finalized outside traditional council structures, raising the question of whether visible authority was, in some cases, reacting to outcomes that had already been determined in unseen environments. As these developments accumulate across different geographical zones, the concept of medieval power begins to fracture into two parallel systems: the formal hierarchy of kings, nobles, and religious institutions, and a concealed mechanism of influence that operates through timing, information control, and selective intervention. What makes this dual structure particularly significant is the absence of direct evidence describing its coordination, which forces interpretation to rely entirely on patterns rather than explicit documentation. Some surviving marginal notes from monastic scribes even suggest a sense of unease when describing events that unfolded too quickly to be accounted for by council, implying that certain transitions of power appeared to bypass normal deliberative processes entirely. While these observations remain indirect, their repetition across independent sources creates a cumulative impression that medieval political reality may have been shaped by forces that deliberately avoided detection within the written record. If such a system existed in any organized form, it would fundamentally alter the understanding of how authority functioned during this period, suggesting that what historians have traditionally interpreted as instability or fragmentation may in fact reflect the visible surface of a far more controlled and deliberate process operating beneath it. As the hidden structure of influence continued to expand across the medieval world, the narrative shifts from patterns of coordination into something even more complex: the emergence of consequences that appear to ripple outward from unseen decisions. By the late medieval period, roughly between the 13th and 15th centuries, the frequency of sudden and unexplained political transformations begins to increase across multiple regions simultaneously, particularly in zones of high strategic importance such as contested borderlands, trade corridors, and religious frontier territories. In many of these cases, chroniclers document the visible outcome of events, such as shifts in leadership or rapid changes in alliance structures, but consistently omit any clear explanation for why these transitions occurred at precisely those moments. This absence of causality becomes a defining feature of the historical record itself, suggesting that the underlying mechanisms driving these changes were either deliberately concealed or operated outside the traditional frameworks of governance and documentation. Within this environment, the previously observed network of hidden influence appears to transition into a more reactive and adaptive system, one that does not simply intervene at isolated points, but instead responds dynamically to instability as it develops. Rather than initiating change in a linear or predictable sequence, this system seems to engage with existing fractures in political structures, amplifying or redirecting them in ways that remain invisible to official accounts. Certain monastic writers and independent observers of the period begin to describe moments of what they call sudden clarity shifts in rule, where decisions that would normally require prolonged negotiation appear to resolve with unusual speed, often without recorded deliberation or council debate. While these descriptions are rare and fragmented, their consistency across different regions suggests that they may be referencing a shared underlying phenomenon rather than isolated anomalies. As this pattern becomes more pronounced, the distinction between visible authority and invisible influence grows increasingly blurred. Political systems that once appeared stable and hierarchical begin to show signs of internal synchronization that cannot be fully explained through conventional diplomatic or military logic. In this context, the idea of a hidden war evolves from a series of isolated incidents into a sustained condition of governance shaped by uncertainty, timing, and selective visibility. The most significant implication of this phase is that power itself may have been operating on two levels simultaneously, one that is documented and preserved, and another that exists only through its effects on the recorded world. If this interpretation is correct, then the medieval historical record does not merely contain gaps in knowledge, but instead reflects a deliberate boundary between what was meant to be seen and what was never intended to be understood, leaving behind a version of history shaped as much by absence as by presence. As the layered structure of medieval influence continued to evolve, the system described in earlier records appears to enter its most complex and least visible phase, one defined not by expansion or direct intervention, but by refinement of control through uncertainty. Between the 13th and 15th centuries, the historical record becomes increasingly fragmented, with major political transitions occurring in ways that are documented only through their outcomes rather than their causes. In multiple regions, particularly those positioned along shifting imperial borders and contested religious zones, events unfold with a level of speed and coordination that appears inconsistent with the administrative capacities recorded for the period. Chroniclers frequently describe moments where decisions of great political importance were finalized with minimal recorded debate, or where entire governing structures were reorganized within periods too short to align with known procedural norms. These recurring anomalies suggest that the mechanisms shaping these outcomes may have operated independently of formal institutions, responding instead to conditions of instability as they emerged. Within this phase, the previously identified hidden network appears to function less as a series of discrete actors and more as an integrated system of observation and response, capable of identifying points of vulnerability within political frameworks and influencing them before they fully developed into open conflict. Rather than acting in visible opposition to established authority, this system seems to have operated through proximity to decision-making environments, exerting influence in ways that left no direct trace in official documentation. Some surviving marginal notes from independent scribes hint at a growing awareness of this phenomenon, describing situations in which outcomes appeared to precede discussion, as if resolution had occurred before deliberation began. These accounts, while lacking explicit detail, contribute to a broader pattern in which causality within the historical record becomes increasingly difficult to reconstruct with confidence. As this phase progresses, the distinction between event and interpretation begins to erode, leaving historians with a sequence of results that appear disconnected from their origins. The implication of this structure is that medieval political reality may have been shaped not only by the actions of visible authorities, but also by an underlying system that operated through timing, information asymmetry, and selective engagement with critical moments in governance. In this context, the concept of open conflict becomes less central than the control of conditions under which conflict could be avoided, redirected, or rendered irrelevant before it fully manifested. The result is a historical landscape in which stability and instability are not opposing forces, but interconnected outcomes of a deeper and largely undocumented process that influence the direction of entire regions without ever being directly acknowledged in the sources that survived. As the medieval system of concealed influence reached its most refined stage, the historical record begins to reflect not just fragmentation of explanation, but fragmentation of certainty itself. By the late medieval period, particularly in the final centuries before the transition into the early modern era, accounts from multiple regions begin to show a consistent inability to fully trace the origins of major political transformations. Events of significant importance, including rapid successions, sudden dissolutions of alliances, and unexpected administrative reorganizations, are frequently recorded without a clear chain of causation. Instead, these sources present outcomes as isolated facts, disconnected from any verifiable sequence of decision-making. This growing disconnect suggests that the mechanisms shaping political reality may have become increasingly detached from visible institutions, operating instead through indirect channels that left minimal documentary trace. Within this environment, the previously identified hidden structure appears to evolve into a self-sustaining system, one that does not rely on direct initiation of events, but instead functions through continuous monitoring of instability and selective engagement with critical junctures. Rather than acting as a traditional power structure with centralized command, it is increasingly portrayed through patterns as a distributed framework, capable of influencing outcomes across vast distances without requiring physical presence in the locations where decisions were formally recorded. Certain medieval observers, particularly those outside official court influence, begin to describe a growing sense that political reality was shaped by forces operating just beyond the reach of recorded governance. These descriptions often emphasize timing as the most significant indicator of external influence, noting that key decisions tended to resolve at moments of maximum instability, as if guided toward resolution by an unseen pressure rather than internal consensus. While such interpretations remain speculative, their repetition across independent sources strengthens the perception that medieval political systems may have contained an additional layer of operational logic not reflected in surviving official records. As this phase progresses, the concept of open conflict becomes increasingly secondary to the concept of controlled outcome, where the visible events of history represent only the final stage of processes that began outside the scope of documented authority. This shift fundamentally alters the interpretation of medieval history, suggesting that what has been preserved may not represent the full reality of political dynamics, but rather the end results of a deeper system of influence that operated continuously beneath the surface of recorded events, shaping the trajectory of entire regions while remaining absent from the narrative structures that defined how history was written and remembered. As the accumulated patterns of concealed influence reach their most advanced conceptual stage, the historical narrative begins to reflect a final and increasingly irreversible transformation in how medieval political reality can be interpreted. By this point in the chronology, the distinction between recorded events and unrecorded causes becomes so deeply blurred that even careful analysis of surviving sources produces only partial reconstructions of what may have actually occurred. Across multiple regions spanning Europe, the Levant, and the transitional zones between empires, the same structural anomaly continues to appear. Major political outcomes are consistently documented, yet the mechanisms behind their emergence remain absent from the official record. This persistent absence is no longer treated as isolated omission, but instead suggests the possibility of a systemic boundary separating what was publicly recorded from what was operationally decisive. Within this framework, the previously described hidden system appears to have evolved into a fully stabilized layer of influence, one that no longer needs to initiate visible disruption, because its role has shifted toward shaping the conditions under which outcomes become inevitable. Rather than acting as a series of interventions within political events, it is now increasingly understood as a continuous presence embedded within the structure of decision-making itself, influencing the timing, direction, and resolution of key historical moments without leaving direct evidence of participation. In this phase, medieval chroniclers and independent observers alike begin to express a recurring sense of incompleteness when describing major transitions of power, as if the explanatory frameworks available to them were insufficient to fully account for what they were witnessing. Some accounts refer indirectly to missing intermediaries or unseen pressures within councils, though these descriptions remain vague and symbolic rather than concrete. Nevertheless, their repetition across different cultural and geographic contexts reinforces the impression that medieval governance may have contained an additional operational dimension that functioned parallel to its visible institutions. As this interpretation develops further, the concept of history itself begins to shift from a linear record of events into a layered structure in which only the final outcomes are preserved with clarity, while the processes that generated them remain obscured or deliberately unrecorded. This creates a historical landscape in which certainty is limited not by lack of events, but by the absence of accessible causality linking those events together. In this sense, the medieval world as reconstructed through surviving documentation may represent only the final surface of a much deeper and more complex system of influence, one that operated continuously beneath the threshold of recorded awareness, shaping the trajectory of entire regions while remaining fundamentally invisible to the narrative structures that preserve the memory of the past. As the final layer of interpretation settles over the reconstructed narrative of medieval hidden influence, what remains is not a conclusion in the traditional sense, but a widening uncertainty that resists closure. Across the entire span of this historical framework, from its earliest fragmented appearances in court records to its most refined conceptual form in later centuries, a consistent pattern emerges. The most significant political transformations are preserved in detail, while the forces that shape them remain absent from documentation. This absence is no longer something that can be explained as simple loss of records or incomplete preservation. Instead, it becomes a defining characteristic of the system itself, suggesting that the structure governing medieval political reality may have been designed in such a way that its most critical mechanisms were never intended to be recorded in the first place. As this interpretation reaches its most advanced stage, the idea of a hidden network evolves into something even more abstract, no longer confined to identifiable groups or coordinated actors, but instead resembling a persistent condition embedded within the flow of historical events. It is the condition defined by selective visibility, where only the final outcomes of complex processes are allowed to enter the written record, while everything that determines those outcomes remains permanently outside it. In this sense, the medieval world becomes less a sequence of documented events and more a filtered representation of a deeper reality that can only be inferred through its effects. What makes this realization particularly unsettling is not the existence of missing information, but the possibility that the absence itself was structured, stable, and consistent across centuries. If that is true, then the historical record is not merely incomplete, but fundamentally shaped by a boundary that determines what can and cannot be known. Even the most detailed chronicles, preserved across monasteries, royal archives, and private collections, may therefore represent only the visible edge of a far larger system that operated without recognition, acknowledgement, or traceable origin. And yet, despite centuries of analysis, comparison, and reinterpretation, no definitive answer emerges to explain why this pattern persists so uniformly across time and geography. The silence within the record does not resolve into clarity, but instead deepens into a question that continues to echo through every attempt at reconstruction. If such a structure truly existed, then the most important part of medieval history may not be what was recorded, but what was consistently and deliberately left unrecorded, leaving behind a legacy not of answers, but of an absence that still cannot be fully explained.